of The Last Rep. I am joined once again by my partner, Mr. Peter McGuff. Peter, a lot has changed in the last couple of weeks. Good to have you back in the studio. Since you last left us, Tiger Woods has won his first tournament in 2.5 years, and we are off to the Masters this week. Speaking of Masters, great to have you back.
Great to be back, Bob. I really missed the show last week, but hope to be a permanent fixture from now on.
Well, you are a fixture. That there is absolutely no question, Peter. And a lot has changed over the last couple of weeks. Why don't you fill the viewers in? I know you've signed a brand new contract with our good friends over at Muscular Development.
Yeah, I've joined Muscular Development. I've been speaking to Steve Blackman. We formed a relationship. I realised, how much he's done for bodybuilding. He's signing athletes and doing things that maybe other entities aren't. I had a great 3 years with Muscle Mag, and Robert Kennedy's a great guy and a gentleman. Bill Geiger, you couldn't have a better editor, a better friend. So I'm just moving onward, more opportunities to do what maybe I am best fitted to do.
And Bill Geiger, who worked for you many years, Peter, obviously at Flex Magazine, of course.
Yeah, we worked together at Flex and Muscle and Fitness in the old days, yeah.
How was it to see some of your students out there? Bill's heading the magazine now, and we want to give our best to Robert Kennedy, of course, a fixture in the bodybuilding community, who hasn't been doing that great health-wise lately, so we understand. He's actually, still hanging in there, still doing his thing, and still as committed to bodybuilding as ever. So our best out to
Absolutely.
Robert Kennedy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and everything's changed. And the funny thing is that joining MD, I realized as I looked at the roster, there's you and Dan Solomon, Lee Haney, Dorian Yates, Sean Ray, Dave Belay, Kevin Leveroni. These are guys who are my friends and who I worked with in the past as colleagues. So in a strange way, it was almost like coming home in one sense. Yeah,
very interesting. Obviously a lot of changes over this last couple of years. And like you mentioned, our good friend Dan Solomon, of course, I co-hosted with many years on PBW, and of course, still pop on from time to time for updates. So a special shout out to our buddy Dan and all the crew over at PBW. They're continuing to do what they do now in its 7th year. So lots of tradition.
Yeah.
Lots of tradition, Peter. And speaking of tradition, we talked a little bit about your past, but you got your start in bodybuilding obviously many years ago, as we've kind of touched on before, but a lot of people don't really know your history, Peter, of bodybuilding, of how you got into the publication business, and basically how you got over here. How did you get to America?
A 747.
And there, I thought you took the train.
I was in the hold,
Yes.
They let me in, and I've been here ever since. It's been 20 years now. Really, I came to America. Joe Weider offered me a job, but what really was my passport to here was the fact that in 1990, my wife and I started a bodybuilding publication. It was a tabloid, a newspaper tabloid. I realized glossy magazines weren't doing that well in England because the competition was Flex and Muscle Mag. And this was pre-internet. I came out with an idea.
Al Gore had not invented the internet at that time.
He was talking about it, but he hadn't actually rubber stamped it.
Gotcha.
So I came up with this idea of, well, what can we do that the glossies can't do? And that's get news out fast. So you can do that faster with newsprint. So we came out with a publication called Pumping Press. And the first challenge was, how do we get a tabloid onto the news shelf? How do we stand it with a magazine? And my wife came up with the idea that we have two covers. Here you have the real front cover. There's your tabloid, it's a newspaper. But if you produce another cover, then it can sit on the shelf and people can.
Very inventive. Basically the same size as a regular magazine. And Peter, as I'm looking through, you talk about a time and a place. here's Dorian Yates, before anybody really knew who Dorian Yates was. And this was your very first issue right here.
That was the first issue. That was Dorian was on the cover. He was just coming through at that time. He aligned himself to Pumping Press, so the timing couldn't have been better. And the great thing was the timeliness. Here we have the Olympia issue, 1991 Mr. Olympia, which was held on a Saturday in Florida. The next weekend, all the guys were in Europe doing the tour. And it was like 10 days after the Olympia, we gave them a copy of the Olympia report, and they couldn't really believe it because you used to wait 2 months to see the report. And here was the whole thing, all the guys All the comparisons, all
Wow,
the
I mean,
interviews.
boy, what a time capsule. I mean, here, we're looking at Dorian and Lee Haney. And Lee Haney at that time, invincible,
Yeah.
thought that he could have gone on to 9, 10 Sandals perhaps, and maybe could have.
Yeah.
But a man named Dorian Yates, and I'm looking at this issue right here, Peter, your 5th issue.
Yeah.
It says a giant shadow looms over Lee Haney. This was actually the first time that he was referred to as a shadow, courtesy of yourself.
Yeah, I came up with the name because he was a shadow in that sense. And also, Dorian's personality was you'd see him at a contest and then you wouldn't hear from him again. He wasn't popping up all over the place. He wasn't, doing the social scene. So he was a bit in the shadow. So that's where the name came from.
Ah, see that? And a trivia question answered right here on the last rep, Peter. I always wondered where that nickname came from. I knew you came up with it, but didn't really know the background. Interestingly, on these two guys, you talk about Dorian and Lee Haney. Lee Haney was the first Olympia champion, if I'm correct, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that didn't really do the West Coast thing. Didn't automatically move to California like previous Mr. Olympias.
Yeah.
But Lee Haney kind of, he had his roots dug in Georgia, in Atlanta, with the community and all that. And he stayed there as being Mr. Olympia. Previously not really thought of at that time.
No, I mean, actually, Lee won his first Olympia, '84. He lived in California for a year, trained with Rich Gaspari. Rich Gaspari won the Nationals that year. They never
That's
trained
right.
together again because now they were rivals. But once he got the title, I think he felt the confidence, no, I don't have to be on the West Coast. And he was more at home in Atlanta, obviously, and he's been there ever since. And of course, Dorian never made the move to California either.
Or the States, really, full-time. He was still a full-time resident of England at the time. Like you say, he won the Olympia and would go back to England. Like you say, you really didn't hear from him too much. The shadow. Well, he truly was a shadow, and a shadow to Lee Haney. We always speculate, Peter, but I always want to get your opinion on this. Lee Haney retired pretty young still, especially if you go by today's, time frame, of course, when guys are turning pro much later and that type of thing. It would have been really interesting to see these two guys battle out for the next 2-3 years. But when Haney beat Dorian in that first Olympia, Haney was pretty dominant over Dorian. And then obviously we saw the transformation of Dorian into the next year or so. Hypothetical, of course, Peter, but always fun to speculate. Could Lee Haney have beaten Dorian for the next 2-3 years, or would Dorian have caught him by then?
In many ways, when you look at those two, there's only a differential. Lee's only 2.5 years older than Dorian, so you'd think their careers would have overlapped, and they didn't. Lee started a lot younger. Dorian's turning 50 this year. Lee's 53. Obviously, Dorian improved. Whether Haney really felt that last one was the exclamation mark. He'd won the 8th. It was the best shape he'd ever been in. And I'm sure he did see Dorian as a threat. I mean, Dorian did actually win the first round, the muscularity round, and then Lee won the symmetry and then won the posing. And this is absolutely true. Maybe pumping press did Dorian no favours, because our Night of the Champions report was out like in June, just 2 or 3 weeks after the Night of the Champions. And when Lee saw pictures of Dorian, he realised it was a threat. He told me that. And it was one of the motivating factors for him to get into the shape of his life. Because at last, here was a guy the same size with a complete physique, the legs and everything. I mean, Christian was the same size but didn't have that overall look. So, maybe pumping press didn't do Dorian any favours in that regard. As to what would have happened, who knows? They're each great in their own era, and we'll never know. It's the rivalry that never was.
Sure. Well, we would have liked to have seen that, of course, for any of the bodybuilding historians out there. But, Peter, before we go to our break, coming up in the next segment, we're talking about a long-standing tradition of bodybuilding champions, the 58th Annual Rochester Bodybuilding Championships, coming up this week. I'll be heading out there in just a few days to host that for Jim Raquel, who's been involved in this for over 36 years now.
Right.
But right now we're going to go to our first break. I'd like to welcome our good friends at Hydrolyze Ultra, brand new here to the last rep.
Hydrolyze Ultra, the leader in cellular hydration water, has been designed by shrinking and reshaping molecules to allow a faster and more sustained delivery into your cells, along with adding electrolytes to our special ingredients. This allows all nutrients to be absorbed at a maximum cellular state. Get the advantage that top athletes have achieved. Try Hydrolyze Ultra today. Visit hydrolyzeultra.com.
MG Supplement Superstore. Number 1.
Welcome back from the break, everyone. I'm Bob Ciccarello, joined with Peter McGuff. Peter, when we left off, we talked about the 58th annual Rochester Bodybuilding Championships, Rochester, New York, my birthplace. The longest running amateur show in the country, 58 years.
58 years. That's
1952, the very first competition. And last year, actually, we had a couple of guys that won these. Carl Lonable, who actually won it, I believe, in like 1954, I think, or 55, is still around the Rochester area, still comes to the competitions every year. So it was quite inspirational to see some of these old champs coming out that are still in Rochester.
Yeah.
And some of those names you were very familiar with, Peter. Not that you know them personally, of course.
Yeah.
But
I'd like to know, what the water's like in Rochester. It's got such a great pedigree of great bodybuilders. I mean, there's Alan Stefan, 1946, Mr. America.
yeah.
The Tannys, Vic Tanny and Armand Tanny.
And for those who don't know, the Tanny brothers, Vic Tanny and Armand Tanny, went on to create what was now regarded as the gym chain.
Absolutely.
This wasn't around back then.
This was an innovation. I mean, we're used to gym chains now. They were the first.
Sure.
And then another coincidence, Pete Grimkowski,
Yeah.
who every time you meet Pete says, "You look terrific." No matter what you look like. You
It
look
is Peter,
terrific.
too. Yeah, that's Peter all day.
But he had the gym chain connection because he was a co-owner of Gold's from 79 to 99 and obviously still around today.
I've talked to guys from Rochester. My old training partner, Larry Baker, Danny Padilla, another great name we'll get into in a minute. They actually had no stories. There's names, again, that nobody else would know. Joe Vazana, some of these early guys from Samson's Gym, and that was the gym to train at if you were in Rochester, New York, started by our own Jim Raquel.
Yeah.
They will tell you the story of Pete Grimkowski. They having this wacky idea. Pete couldn't get people to put money in. He was looking for investors at the time.
Right.
And it wasn't a lot. He was looking for like $5,000 or something small. But, again, this is back in the 70s. He couldn't, people thought he was out of his mind because he wanted to take this money, drive out to California in this old vet that had no brakes apparently, and get involved in this gym chain, some gym called Gold's Gym that was out on the West Coast only. And they thought he was completely out of his mind. Nobody would give him any money.
No.
Obviously, Pete getting the last laugh on that, turning Gold's Gym into the most recognizable gym chain in the history of the world. And Pete finally got those brakes fixed on that vet and probably did himself a little bit better, Peter, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and him and his partners, they sold it for millions in 99, Set for Life.
Tim Kimber, another Rochester transplant. He actually got a couple of guys together, but this was not thought of as a good investment back then.
No.
They thought, and Pete was out there. I mean, Pete.
Yeah.
And like I say, that's exactly the greeting he would give every time I would see him. Danny Padilla, obviously probably the most noted name of great bodybuilders come out of Rochester. The original giant killer, Peter, often imitated but never duplicated.
Yeah, probably the best built short man ever in his prime. And the thing about Danny, which is different from other short guys, and I'm trying to say this the correct way, if you see a picture of a guy in a magazine, you can tell whether he's tall or not, even though he can only be 11 inches tall.
Sure.
You can tell a short guy because usually there's some heads a little bit out of proportion. Danny had perfect proportions. He could have been 5'10". If it had been 5'10", he would have been Mr. Olympia.
I was just going to ask you that question because we've heard that many times over the years, especially if you're into old school bodybuilding, that if Danny proportionally was blown up to 5'9", 5'10", because Danny was only 5'2" on a good day, but that he had perfect proportions, could have been a Mr. Olympia that nobody could have beaten back then.
Absolutely, and of course, 1981, the big controversy where he got into the shape of his life, his face was sunken in. Everybody thought he was going to win because those proportions, that symmetry, and he gets fifth, and that was the biggest boo fest of all time.
Well, let me ask you, Peter. You were probably there, I'm guessing, at that competition. So, should Danny have won that competition?
I think he should have done. His level of conditioning was way above anybody at that time. In fact, in some ways, it broke new ground.
And much different for Danny himself, who was known to come in a little bit off. Great proportions, great muscle, nice round muscle bellies. Danny had it all, but if there was one knock, one Achilles heel to him, it was that he would come in a little bit soft. So for him to come in that ripped condition that year, nobody was expecting.
Yeah, and that's what he'd been told to do. If you come in ripped, it's yours, and he did it. And of course, after that, he never got into that condition again. Probably the drive wasn't there for him.
Not just for Danny, but almost all those guys. I mean, that show was pivotal when it comes to the history of bodybuilding, and that a lot of guys never recovered from that competition, from that era of between 80 and 81. Arnold winning in 80, of course, and some kind of a controversy. Although I still think to this day, that he wins, even though he wasn't 100%, they're close to it. Probably still the best physique. 81, you don't really have that case, Peter. I mean, I thought Padilla was head and shoulders above anybody else. Especially,
well, he wasn't head and shoulders.
Yeah, good point. Nobody was head and shoulders above anybody in that competition. But honestly, if you swap him and Franco, I mean, you can easily make a case for Franco being 5th and Danny being 1st. The only guy to put Danny in 1st place in that competition, Jim Mannion, who was judging that show.
Yeah, that was his first Olympia, Jim's, and he was the only judge that saw it that way. And I think most people agreed with him.
Well, congratulations, Jim. You're the only judge that knew what you were doing that competition. But controversy just seemed to follow Danny around throughout his whole career. He was never short when it came to different things coming his way, Peter, that were out of his control. Most notably, in 1979, the second year of the Night of the Champions, and that show already catching on some ground back then as being innovative and very different. Robbie Robinson won the first one in 78. A very conditioned Danny Padilla shows up in 1979, records the first perfect score in bodybuilding history. He scored it. He did a point system back then, as you all know. A perfect 300, 100 each round, but lost a competition to Robbie Robinson. How does this happen? How do you score a perfect 300, Peter, and lose?
Absolutely. I mean, it was the first 300 perfect score in a pro contest. Remember Mike Menser got 300 in the 78 World Amateur Championship.
It was Acapulco back then?
Mexico, yeah.
That's right.
Well, I mean, they suddenly decided they needed an extra comparison at the end. I mean, I think you know the story better than I, because
I do. Well, my buddy Larry Baker, who I want to give a shout out to, I'll be seeing him this week in Rochester. He was Danny's training partner, and Danny's got a lot of stories from the old days. We all love Danny Padilla. He's got great stories from the back. You don't know how many of those fish stories have kind of changed over the years. But Larry was there. He was actually backstage. They actually pulled Danny out of the shower. He actually had soap in his hair and stuff. He was actually showering up. The show was finished. And they called him back, and they said,
did put his trunks on.
I'm hoping, yeah. I mean, at least by the time he got back on stage. But they actually, yelled out to him in the shower that he needed to get back out there because they wanted to see another pose down. Danny thought the show was over. He thought he had won. So, God only knows what really went on back there. But Larry was there. He did witness this, so it's an actual true event and true story. And he does. They pull him out. He dries himself off, throws a little oil on. He goes back out on the stage, proceeds to lose the final pose down, and subsequently lose the competition to Robbie Robinson. So, as it turns out, as history records, the only guy to score a perfect 300 on a pro stage and lose. Unfathomable, really, in today's day.
Absolutely. Now, look, we talked about some great bodybuilders from Rochester, but one that we shouldn't forget, the man who's appeared on the Olympia stage more times than anyone else. Any guesses?
Not one.
Robert Ciccarello.
Oh, look at Peter pulling that one out.
So, Hall of Famer.
Hall of Famer. I was inducted in 2008. My good friend Jim Rockel thought me bestowed to be worthy of the Rochester Bodybuilding Hall of Fame, the only one inducted that year, and Rock did that on purpose, which I thank him for to this day. Interestingly enough, Peter, a little trivia for you. I never won the Mr. Rochester competition. And you can go down here, some great names on that. Pete Grimkowski, Danny Padilla won it. George Farah, obviously my good friend, and a guy who helped me get my pro card. All these guys won the Rochester. I actually never won the competition. I won the teenage Rochester back in '84. But what happened is by the time I got to a point that I would have won it, I actually won the Junior Nationals in '87, which was a bigger show, and then proceeded to go on to the '87 Nationals, where I made my pro debut along with Sean Ray and Phil Hill and a lot of the greats of that time. So I actually never got a chance to win the Rochester.
I think it's time for a comeback.
You've
got to get that W.
I don't know about that one. Listen, the only thing tougher than putting your trunks back on, Peter, is fitting back into them. That's for sure. With that, we're going to take our second break, Peter. When we come back, we're going to talk about the brand new system in place, which rewards guys too deep in each class for their pro card. After the break.
What's up? This is Cedric McMillan. Listen, get your ass down to the MD Supplement Superstore. Peace.
Hydrolyze Ultra, the leader in in cellular hydration water has been designed by shrinking and reshaping molecules to allow a faster and more sustained delivery into your cells, along with adding electrolytes to our special ingredients. This allows all nutrients to be absorbed at a maximum cellular state. Get the advantage that top athletes have achieved. Try Hydrolyze Ultra today. Visit hydrolyzeultra.com.
All right, and we're back from the break. Peter, when we last left off, we were talking about some of the old days, and before we get into some of the new changes that have taken place this year, I just want to touch a little bit back on some of the craziness going on back then. We talked about Danny and being no stranger to confrontation and strange things going on, but that wasn't all that followed Danny. We go back to pumping iron, which I've seen countless times, as you have, I'm sure.
Right.
But there's one part in there, and we all remember it, where Danny's sitting there and he's commenting on Franco hitting the lat spread.
Yeah.
And he says, man, he can fly with those lats. Now, that's in South Africa. And a lot of people want to know, well, why was Danny in South Africa? Because he didn't compete. Well, as it turns out, Danny won his class at the World Championships and his right to represent the U.S., as they had light, heavy, and medium classes at that competition. But if you look at pumping iron, that's not the way it panned out. We end up with two heavyweights in Katz and Waller, Ed Corney, and no Danny Padilla.
Right.
So why were there two heavyweights but no lightweight in pumping iron?
Well, of course, the consensus is that pumping iron had to be made entertaining and have storylines. And one of the storylines that George Butler came up with was the rivalry between Mike Katz and Ken Waller, the famous scene where, the
Waller T-shirt and all the stuff.
T-shirt and Mike just about has a nervous breakdown, which was a load of hooey, actually. So he wanted to continue that. So somehow he was able to get the American team to be changed so that both Katz and Waller were in South Africa competing each other to complete that storyline.
And Danny was there because, again, he had earned the right to be there, and they made this. They kind of made this switch at the last minute, so they really kind of deprived him of his chance to represent the U.S. And there's a lot more backstory. That Danny actually, there was some speculation, was going to go join the Puerto Rican team and represent their lightweights, and of course, Ben Weeder, bless his soul, wasn't going to have any of that, but. No. Danny's certainly no stranger when it comes to controversy and strange shenanigans.
Not short on controversy, Danny.
He was not short. Controversy. That's a British term.
Yeah. We're going to change the language over here eventually.
Well, you changed it. I'm speaking English. You're speaking Queen's English.
I beg your pardon.
But we talked to. We talk about those days, and we talk about some of the old timers. We talked about the Rochester competition. I've got to give out props where they're due. Jim Rockell's putting this show on, I think, for the 37th year of those 58 years. So he has been a rock when it comes to bodybuilding in Rochester for these many years. So.
Didn't you and The Rock compete, not in the same class, but you entered the same contest?
We did, Peter, actually. 1981, I just turned 15 years old. Me and Rock competed in the 1981 natural teenage Mr. America competition, Jim in the Open. So we actually did compete on the same stage in different classes back then. A lot of people don't know Rock's got a bodybuilding background. He actually walked the walk.
Oh, yeah.
I ended up taking fourth in that competition at 15, but that really kind of started my entire teenage career, as it would be. But me and Jim, we traveled everywhere, Peter. We drove to all kinds of competitions, Utica, Jamestown, all these different areas, Albany, Pittsburgh, New York City. And it was, Jim was obviously trying to get his feet wet in judging at that time. I was competing in the teenage. So we would drive to these shows. And Jim, very much a father figure to me, Peter, for many, many years, and continues to be. And I'll be seeing all the boys out there in Rochester this week. So if you're in the Rochester area, you want to see a great competition, it's at the Rochester Riverside Convention Center. That's this Saturday coming up, day before Easter this year, Peter.
So you'll have your bunny outfit on.
I will have my bunny outfit on, yes, and a matching tie, of course.
Are you hearing this, Rochester?
Yes, Rochester will be there in full force, Peter. There's no question in my mind to continue that great tradition that goes on. Well, Peter, before we went to the break, I mentioned that there's a lot of changes at the national level this year in particular. And I got to address one that doesn't really sit well with me, probably because I'm a little old school as you are, maybe in my thinking, but I got to get your 2 cents on this. It's just come to my attention that they are now giving pro cards in the top 2 positions in each class at the national championship. So that means if you're first or second, you get that golden ticket into the pros. And I can't say that this sits well with me.
No, I mean, you're right. Old school, maybe we've got a different way of thinking, but there used to be a time when just the overall champion or the national winner won overall at the USA, as you know. And what that did is you had to fight for that pro card. You had to earn it. You'd get people like Wheeler and Levrone and Mike Francois, guys who went on to be great professionals, would have to compete several times to get that pro card. Now I think it's going to be given too soon to some guys. If you can't be the best amateur in your division that year, you're going to struggle in the pros. I mean, just lately, last few years, not a lot of the champions have come through and made an impact. Evan Centopani
Right.
was one, Seth Ferosis another. But it's not like the old days when Levrone came in and his first year as a pro was runner-up in the Olympia. Same with Flex Wheeler. Same with, Cormier was in the top 6
Right.
of the Olympia. These guys have struggled, so I don't see why the second place guy, he's going to be even worse off.
Well, and is it smart though, Peter? I mean, from a standpoint of development of the athlete, if you're a second place guy, that means you weren't good enough to get the job done. Let's just call it what it is. This is competition here. That said, is putting that guy in the pros at that point damaging to his potential career? I mean, going into the pros when you're not ready, and you couldn't have won the overall championship at your respective competition at the USA, the Nationals, the North Americans, whatever it might be. Is that guy seasoned? Is he ready to take on the pros, or is he just going to get his head beat in for the next 2-3 years and then disappear off the scene?
Yeah, I think you've got to be king of your division to make it. And even then, some guys, Evan was one who took his time. He knew he wasn't ready even then, even though he was third in the Arnolds during the Olympia. He did the right route. But, a second place guy, he's not the best amateur in the country. I don't know how he's going to survive in the break. It's not fair to them in a way because it's too soon. It could be a road to nowhere.
And where does it come in? Where does the prestige go on, Peter, of the title? You all know my story, as a lot of people do. I mean, I was no overnight success. It took me 13 years to get that title. But to me, the title was everything. I wanted the title.
Yeah.
I could have retired the day after I won that and been perfectly fine that, I did it.
Yeah.
I got my goal. I'm Mr. USA. But
you got the overall. You didn't even.
I won the
win
overall.
Division heavyweight.
That's right.
Overall at the USA 2000. Now, something we discussed earlier. Tell us about 1989, if this rule had applied then.
Well, interesting. You talk about how history could rewrite itself, Peter. But in 1989, that's right, 8-9, it wasn't a typo. I competed in the USA that year. I took second place by a point or two, literally, to Johnny Morant, who was one of the big timers back then. And there was no super heavyweight at the time back then. There was only a heavyweight, which means everybody was in that class, which means double the amount of guys that were there were still there after somebody won the overall. But I took second to Morant. Had this rule been around then, I conceivably would have turned pro in 1989. That some 10, 11 years before I actually would eventually get my pro card. But you kind of wonder, and you kind of go through the history books of, geez, how would that have changed things? Would I have done well as a pro back then? I don't think so. And I'm just being realistic with that. The competition was way tougher back then. It was a lot deeper. A lot more depth when it came to quality competitors in these shows. But I don't think I was ready mature physique-wise, Peter. I think I needed more years of seasoning, of training. I had a big frame to fill out at 6 foot tall in a very wide frame. I had the structure, but if I look back at pictures back then, I think I was a little more on the thin side of what I eventually would have morphed into when it came to being a big-time bodybuilder. I don't think that would have helped me.
So say you turned pro in 89 and entered, I don't know, the 1999 the champions and Yates and all those guys there, Sonny Schmidt. Do you perceive that you might have ended your pro career pretty early?
I think it would have been done in 90. Yeah. But I mean, look at some of these names we can throw around, though, Peter, from that era. I would have been competing against Dorian Yates, Flex Wheeler, Chris Cormier. I mean, I competed against some of these guys as amateurs. But I think they were ahead of me in terms of again, development. I was a lot bigger than a lot of those guys in terms of structure. But some of those top names, DeMay was still kicking around. Gasperi was still competing. I couldn't have touched these guys. But
Lee Labrada,
I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, again, we're talking about a whole different era and time when it comes to competing. But I think the bottom line comes to this, Peter. Again, maybe we're entrenched in old school. But to me, it meant something for that title, and I still think that should still mean something. I know times have changed. I know there's different reasons as to why some of these changes have come down the pike. We're seeing new divisions now with the women's physique, men's physique, and I think that's great for a lot of the people competing out there today who don't want to be, big-time bodybuilders. I think it gives everybody a platform. But for me, and I'll speak only for myself on this one, I still think there's a prestige of the old days of winning the title that to me was important.
Yeah, that was the guy that went on the cover. You know, everybody knew that guy. It was like a trivia test. Who won the overall in whatever year it was? Now it's getting a bit. The whole thing's merging. What year did this guy turn pro?
That's right. And who won the overall 2000 USA, Peter?
Mr. Robert Ciccarello.
How about that? And with that, we're going to go to our last commercial break. And when we come back, the last word.
Hey guys, this is Branch Warren. Check out the MD Supplement Superstore.
All right, Peter, my last word this week is on knowing when to say when. There's too many athletes these days that just don't know when to hang them up. We see bodybuilders out on stage year after year after year, well past their prime. This is the only sport I've ever seen that in. I mean, most people kind of know, when it's time to hang them up, when it's time that you don't want to be out there in front of the public with less than your best. But for some odd reason, and I've seen this many, many years now, bodybuilders seem to think that there's no moratorium when it comes to putting those trunks on and getting on stage. Now, this is foreign to me because I had a perfect opportunity years ago in 2006, getting ready for the Masters World Championships, which I decided before the show, this was going to be my last show, win, lose, or draw. And of course, as fate would have it, I did end up winning the show. Perfect time to raise that hand in the air, spike a nail into the wall with my hammer, and hang my trunks up on it. And that was my ticket and my cue to say, thank you, good night, everybody. Now, not everybody has an opportunity to hang them up while on top, but there has to come a point where you just know you don't have it anymore. Age is not your best friend when it comes to bodybuilding. This is not like fine wine where you get better with age. What you generally see is after the age of 40, things start to kind of not look like they used to. And that's usually a good sign to say, you know what, I want the people to remember me for what I looked like before, when I was in my prime, not have people in the audience and saying to themselves, geez, this guy was a whole lot better years ago. Geez, you should have seen this guy, 3-4 years ago. I never wanted to be that guy. So my last word to everybody out there today is, don't be that guy. And that's my last word.